السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة بدعة، وكل بدعة ضلالة، وكل ضلالة في النار. أما بعد. Then I begin by mentioning the great importance of the subject matter that our brothers at Maktabatul Muwahhideen have organized, and that is the topic of debunking the ISIS propaganda machine. And no doubt this organization, Daesh, which refers to itself as an Islamic State, that they have a very sophisticated propaganda machine by way of which they utilize the internet and social media and other forms of computer technology to propagate their message of khuruj and takfir, of rebellion, of fighting the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and of takfir, declaring other Muslims to be apostates and kuffar. This is a very sophisticated media machine that they possess, and it is primarily aimed at the youth and the young ones from the ummah. It is not aimed at the ulama or the scholars, because there is no alim or scholar that is with them, and the ulama, they see through them, and the ulama refute them. The ulama of Ahlul Sunnah, the ulama of Salafiyah, those who follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, that they, walillahi alhamd, and all praises due to Allah, that they were never deceived by Daesh or the propaganda of ISIS. But unfortunately, many of the youth in many of the lands of the Muslims, and even in non-Muslim lands such as Europe, the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, and the various islands within the Caribbean, that many of the shabab and many of the youth, and even just generally the general folk who are ignorant, and they get carried by the wave of propaganda and this general feeling that there is something upon the horizon. But in reality, when one looks through the dust and looks through the smoke screen, you will not find except the ISIS, who are in reality the Khawarij of this age, are nothing more than the enemies and the plants of the enemies within the ranks of the Muslims. They are nothing but the support and the voice box of Shaitan that has been invented to deceive and to corrupt the hearts and the minds and the belief and the creed of Muslims, and to divide them more than they are already divided, and to wreak havoc and bloodshed upon the Muslim ummah. The topic that myself particularly that I have been given is related to the position of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and likewise Muhammad bin Saud or Ibn Saud, who are the two, in essence, the two individuals upon which the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi state, it was upon their efforts and their da'wah and their exertions that the present Saudi state is where it is today, after Allah, of course, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Saudi state that we have today, or the Mamlakatul Arabiyyah Saudiya that we have today, is actually the third incarnation. It is the third Saudi state. The first Saudi state actually ran in the Common Era, or the Christian calendar, or the Western calendar, from 1744 to 1818. And that was the era of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. It was the era of the king, the first king of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Muhammad bin Saud, who died in the Hijri calendar, in the year 1179 after the Hijrah. So these two, in reality, and one can go into a huge amount of detail with regard to their lives and their efforts, and with regard to the situation in which they lived and the environment in which they lived. But that's maybe a discussion that we can touch upon as we go along. But in detail, that's for another occasion. But suffice to say that it was Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab who gave da'wah to the family of Ali Saud. It began by giving da'wah to the brothers of Muhammad bin Saud, and then to the wife of Muhammad bin Saud, who were convinced by the da'wah to Tawheed, that Islam, its foundation is Tawheed, to worship Allah alone. And there was a particular reason why Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, that why he began with this. And that is because that was the call of the prophets and the messengers. You notice that in reality, when one looks at the most popular works and the most monumental works of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, whose dawah influence was the affair or the da'wah or the knowledge that affected all of those individuals who followed his call in his era and even after him, most of it, if not all of it, rotates around the issue of Tawheed and the rectification of the Aqidah. So when he gave his da'wah in his home city of Uyayna in the very early years, and then later on in some of the other villages in that region of Najd, which is a desert region in the eastern side or the northeastern side of the Arabian Peninsula, that in this hot, vast desert region, that when he began giving his da'wah, it was a da'wah to Tawheed, because that is the da'wah of the prophets and the messengers. وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. And we did not send a messenger except to every nation, calling them to the worship of Allah and away from the worship of the false deities. So this was his call. Kitab al-Tawheed, Usul al-Thalatha, Qawaid al-Arba, Usul al-Sitta. When you look at those monumental works, all of them rotate around the rectification of the Aqidah and a specific focus upon the issue of Tawheed. And Muhammad bin Saud and the family of Saud, they were convinced by that da'wah after he had migrated to Dir'iyah. And Dir'iyah is a small town or a small village in those times that was connected or just outside of Riyadh. So when he reached there, Muhammad bin Saud, he was the ruler of that place. And he gave his da'wah. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, who was an alim, a scholar, a muhaddith, a mufassir, a scholar of history, a scholar of aqidah, a scholar of sunnah, a scholar of hadith. He had mastered many of the fields of Islamic knowledge. So by the time he reached Dir'iyah, after he had studied with various scholars, then many of the people started accepting the da'wah in Dir'iyah as they had accepted in many of the other outlying villages in the Najd region. But since this topic is in reality concerning the relationship of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah and the relationship of Muhammad bin Saud as it relates to the Ottoman Empire or the Dawla Uthmaniyya, then this is what we have to say. And the answer in reality, when the people say, did he rebel? Wasn't there already a Khilafah? Wasn't there already an Islamic state that was controlling that area where Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud, that they were living and their families were, and those tribes were? Isn't the reality that the Ottoman Empire had strength there, and they had authority there, and their Khilafah was present there? Then, in reality, the fact is that actually the Ottomans had no control over Najd. The Turkish Ottoman Empire, it is true, had pockets of sovereignty over the Arabian lands. But in reality, it became little more than a hollow shell in places like Egypt and Syria and Iraq by the 18th century. So by the 18th century, meaning the 18th century in the Western calendar, that they hardly had any authority. And it was little more than a hollow shell. And now we're talking about places such as Iraq, places such as Syria and Egypt, that it was just merely a hollow shell in those areas. And the tribes and the people who lived there and their leaders, they were the ones who were in reality in charge of the affairs there. And this was in the 18th century. Now, when you consider that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah was born in 1703, so this is the century that we're talking about. In the century that we're talking about, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in the Common Era or in the Western calendar was born in 1703. He died in 1792. So in that period of time, in actuality, in the Arabian Peninsula, as far as the Arabian Peninsula is concerned, then the Ottomans never inhabited the vast areas of the Najd. Because Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, of course, was born in Uyayna. And Uyayna is in Najd. And in all of that area of the Najd, in what is known as the Wadi, in those villages that stretch across the Wadi, stretch across that valley, the Wadi Hanifa, in that region, in actuality, the Ottomans had no authority there. They had no rulership there. They had no strength there. There was nothing of that nature with them in that region, in any of those villages, whether it be Manfuha or Riyadh or Arqa or Uyayna or Jubayla or Huraymila or Al-Amariya or Malham. In any of these villages that were well known in the Najd, whether it be Qasim and other than that, Burayda, going as far north as Al-Ruwayda, the Ottoman Empire had no authority. They had no authority. And that is a historical fact from the Ottomans themselves and other than the Ottomans from the various historians. So the closest area that they had some control in were places like Baghdad and Basra. And the closest they ever came to the Najd was at a place called Al-Ahsa. Al-Ahsa on the eastern board or towards the eastern board of the present Arabian Peninsula or the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia today. And that was in 1592. They had the Turks, or they had a Turkish garrison at Al-Hufuf in 1592. When was Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab born? Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was born in 1703. So really we're talking somewhere in the region of a century before that they had some sort of outpost or Turkish garrison at Hufuf. But as far as the Najd and the vast areas of the Najd, they had no authority and they never inhabited that area. So even at Hufuf, which they inhabited in 1592, the Common Era, the Christian era, it was only 80 years thereafter, so let's say 1670 or thereabouts, which is still somewhere in the region of half a century, or even more than half a century, close to a century before Muhammad bin Saud, that even from Al-Hufuf, that the Bedouin tribe of Banu Khalid fell upon the Turks and expelled them. So the only place which thereafter even recognized the Ottoman rule was the Hijaz and the Sharifs of Mecca, who looked towards the Ottomans only for protection. So that was in the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina. But as for the Najd, they never inhabited it. The furthest they got was Al-Hufuf, where they had a garrison a century or more before Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud. And it was, and even from there they were repelled from some of the Bedouin tribes, such as the tribe of Banu Khalid. So the only place that they had some authority, the Sharifs of Hijaz, they looked towards the Ottomans for protection. As for political power in the Najd itself, then there was no single political power in the Najd in the time of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So that brings us actually to this accusation that is made, that is it not true that the family of Saud, the Ali Saud, or the rulers of Saudi Arabia in that time, they rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. They were the Khilafah and they rebelled against it. But you can only rebel against a group of people who have authority where you live. So since the Ottomans had no authority when Muhammad bin Saud was, and actually each village and each township had its own king, and the whole of the Najd had been broken up into minute particles for centuries, and the Turks had never ventured there, had never ventured that far inland. And one of the great scholars, Ibn Bishr, of the 19th century, meaning within that time period of the first Saudi state, he mentions the case, and he gives a very poignant example. He mentions the case of the tiny settlement of At-Tuwaim in Sudair, in Najd, where he mentions in 1120 after the Hijrah. So in reality, 1120 after the Hijrah is, if you consider this was when Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was only 5 years old. So it's about 1710 or thereabouts in the common era, in the Western calendar. So when Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was still a baby, 5 years old or thereabouts, that in 1120 in this township of Tuwaim in Sudair in Najd, 4 leaders were competing for the right to be the king of that small township. So none of the 4 was individually strong enough to overcome his rivals. So what did they do? They sat down and they divided the settlement and the town into 4 sections, so that each of them could at least be a sovereign over a quarter of the town. So this was the situation in all of the townships. In Najd at the time, each township, each village, had its own leader, had its own king. And each of them would fight each other. If he died, then the next one would fight with each other to gain leadership. And this carried on for decades and decades, if not hundreds of years. This is how severe the situation had become. And when Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, when he was gaining knowledge and he was studying, that he noticed what was taking place in the region of Najd and in the Arabian Peninsula in general, and in reality around the world. So there was the domed, for example, he recognized and he knew that in Al-Jubayla, in a township or in a village that was not far from where he was born, Al-Jubayla, that there was the domed shrine of Zayd ibn al-Khattab, and that the people used to go there. And this was in Al-Jubayla, in Wadi Hanifa, in the Najd, not far from where Shaykh al-Islam. So they had in that village a domed shrine, and the people used to go there, and they used to seek intercession, and they used to seek deliverance, istighatha and isti'ana and refuge with the inhabitant of the grave, Zayd ibn al-Khattab, radiyallahu anhu. In Dir'iyah, where Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab eventually ended up, after being expelled from village after village, from Iraq he was expelled, and then he was expelled from, after he returned back from his home village where his father was. He was expelled from that after his father passed away, and he was expelled from Uyayna. And eventually when he returned, when he went to Dir'iyah, and that was the home township of Muhammad ibn Saud, the founder of the first Saudi state, that even in that township there were tombs and shrines attributed as being tombs and shrines of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And people used to travel to Dir'iyah to come to these graves and to seek help from them, as the great scholar Hussein ibn al-Ghannam, that he mentioned. The Hussein ibn al-Ghannam, who was one of the scholars of his time, from the era, or just at the end of the era of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he mentions that in Rawdatul Afkar, that the people used to travel to the graves. In the little village of Al-Fida, there was a male date palm tree, an unmarried woman seeking a husband would embrace the trunk and call out, "O palm of the male palms, I desire a husband before I become barren," as Ibn Ghannam mentions. They used to come day and night, and women, men and women, seeking blessings from that tree. Ibn Ghannam, rahimahullah, he mentions in his history of the region, he mentions that there was a tree, the tamarisk tree or the tarfa tree, and it was a favorite place upon which to hang pieces of cloth when a boy was born, believing that it would protect him from the hand of death. Below Dir'iyah, right now, you should have in your mind the Najd area. Dir'iyah, in reality, was the center point as far as the da'wah of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is concerned. And this was the place where Muhammad bin Saud was the leader in that small village, very small village. It is still there today, actually. If anyone wishes to visit, you'll find many of the olden houses and the olden mud-built and mud brick-built houses. You'll still see them there that are, a few centuries old. Below Dir'iyah, there was a great cleft in the mountain known as Ghar Bintul Amir, or the cave of the daughter of the Amir, which those people, they believed, those superstitious people in the time of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, that they believed that it had been opened, that cave had been opened by Allah in response to a cry for help uttered by a girl of noble birth when a man tried to take her honor. So people would visit the cave, and they would leave meat and bread as offerings. They would even throw out meat and sacrifice animals, slaughter the meat and throw it out into the open desert as a sacrifice for the jinn, hoping that the jinn would leave them alone and not bother them. So all of this used to take place. Even in Jeddah, they had built a tomb, 60 cubits long, in which they claimed was buried Hawa, the wife of Adam alayhi salam. They built over it 3 domes. It was approximately, the whole structure was about 150 meters long. It was 4 meters broad, and it was 1 meter high. They placed one dome that they claimed was at the head of Hawa or Eve, the wife of Adam alayhi salam. They placed one dome over her navel and one at her feet. Then the tomb keepers and those people looked after the shrine, that they would stand at the gates and they would collect the money from the people and then allow them admission. So they used to charge admission fee. In Medina, at the time of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, people prostrated themselves before the grave of the Prophet ﷺ and rubbed their cheeks in the dust. They would make celebrations at the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. They would openly seek his aid. They had tombs and shrines in the Baqi, or the graveyard, where many of the companions were buried. So when you look at the situation wherein Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab came out to call the people to Tawheed, he called the people to Tawheed who were involved in shirk. Now, when you ask the question, or if a person was to ask the question, well, what's that got to do in reality with the relationship of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and the Ottoman Empire? The reason is that the da'wah of Tawheed that Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was upon, and the da'wah of Tawheed that Muhammad ibn Saud propagated from Dir'iyah after he accepted the da'wah of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, rahimahullah, that the history that was written thereafter by the opposers of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was written for a very good reason. It was altered, it was changed, and a huge amount of propaganda surrounded it. Why? Because one thing that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab did that really damaged the da'wah of the people of Sufiya, the grave worshippers, and the Shia likewise, is that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab did not tolerate grave worship. So when the da'wah of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab began to spread, then of course the first people to suffer were the Sufis, because their da'wah decreased, and the graves at which they used to worship and they built shrines upon and mausoleums upon and domes upon, those graves now were being knocked down and brought right down to the ground. As the Prophet ﷺ or Ali radiallahu anhu said, that I was commanded by the Prophet ﷺ not to go past a grave except to level it to the ground. and not to go past a statue or an image except that I should deface it. Because the grave worship was open, apparent polytheism and idolatry being committed in front of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So the more people that accepted his da'wah, the less the people wanted to go to the shrines. And the more they realized the evil of visiting the shrines and seeking aid from the dead. When one looks at the da'wah, or what the Ottoman Empire was upon at that time, then they were the most staunchest of the Sufis and grave worshippers. So now, there wasn't just a conflict in terms of land, because, as we mentioned, the Ottoman Empire had no authority and they did not inhabit the areas of the Najd. But there was a clash of ideologies, because most of that which was taking place in the time of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad ibn Saud at that time, in terms of religious activity, then it was either Shia in places like Iraq, i.e. Karbala or Najaf and those places, or on the other side it was the Sufis and what they did in the Baqi', in the graveyard in Medina next to the Prophet's mosque, and what they were doing at the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, and what they were even doing in Mecca. They would go to the grave of Khadeejah radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, who was buried in the graveyard of Mecca. And they would likewise go to her grave, upon which there was built a shrine, and they would seek and they would call upon her. The calling that only is for Allah. So instead of calling upon Allah, they would call upon the created beings in their graves, asking them for help and aid and assistance. So, what happened in the time of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, after Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he studied. He studied in Basra, he studied in Medina, he studied under numerous scholars. He learnt the knowledge of the deen, of Tawheed and Sunnah and Hadith and Tafsir and the Arabic language. And he became a great scholar in fiqh, in many of the various fields of Islamic knowledge. He became a scholar. He himself, of course, came from a family of scholars, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. His father was the scholar, the Shaykh Abdul Wahhab bin Sulaiman. He was a scholar of the Hanbali madhab. He was the Qadi, in fact, of Al-Uyayna, the birthplace of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And likewise, the grandfather of Shaykh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he also was a scholar. So, Abdul Wahhab was a scholar. His father, Sulaiman, was a scholar. Abdul Wahhab bin Sulaiman was the Qadi of Al-Uyayna, the judge. And his grandfather had also been a judge, Sulaiman bin Ali bin Muhammad. His grandfather was also a great scholar of fiqh in the Najd. And they all descended, of course, from the tribe of Tamim. In addition to this, the various journeys that he traveled. As we mentioned, by the age of 10, he had memorized the Quran. By the age of 12, he had matured and he had married. And he was leading the prayer. Then he performed Hajj in his early teens. Performed Hajj. And then when he went to Hajj, after that, he went to Medina. And he met some of the scholars, Muhammad Hayat Sindhi, for example, on his second visit to Medina. And then when he returned to Uyayna, he realized the innovations that the people were involved in. So after studying and then traveling to Basra in Iraq, and then he had the intention of traveling to Sham to study with the scholars of the Hanabila there. He studied with Shaykh Muhammad al-Majmu'i, who was a scholar of Aqidah and Tawheed in Iraq. So he studied in various places. And when he was in Iraq, of course, he wasn't far from the tomb and the shrine of Ali in Najaf. And the tomb and the shrine that the Shia had built in Karbala. So eventually, as his dawah became stronger and more, and of course, he was an extremely eloquent speaker, that more and more people began to accept the da'wah. But the question here in reality is, so where was the Ottoman Empire in all of this? The fact remains that the Ottoman Empire had no authority in the Najd. They had no authority in the Najd. So when Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he was teaching the people in Dir'iyah, and Muhammad bin Saud came to sit in his circles. Then Muhammad bin Saud made a pact with him. He said to him that I will carry this religion that you are teaching, the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, this Quran and Sunnah and Tawheed and the Aqidatul Sahiha, the correct Islamic belief, that I will support you in this. And let us unite all of these rival groups and parties and tribes that are killing each other and fighting against each other, and they are worshipping the graves and they are worshipping the dead. If you support me in that, then we can unite the people upon the worship of Allah. So Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab by that time had already been writing. He had already been writing letters to the various towns and villages and the leaders of the tribes and the kings of the various townships. I mean, we call them kings in the loose sense, even though some of them may be only in charge of a few hundred people, but they regarded themselves to be sovereigns of the village in the Najd. No Ottoman Empire, no Ottoman rule, no authority. There was banditry. There was highway robbery. The rights of the people were being taken. And there was no rule of law in reality. There was only the rule of the desert and the law of the desert and the laws of the Bedouins. So when Muhammad bin Saud went to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and then Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab gave him the Pledge of Allegiance as the ruler of Dir'iyah and the ruler of the state of Tawheed, and that the dawah would be carried to the various townships by way of students of knowledge and the scholars carrying the knowledge to them. And then over time that these various villages and townships will be united, because this is a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not something that was just invented. A command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَاعْتَسِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. And hold on all of you together to the rope of Allah and be not divided. So they came together. The Pledge of Allegiance was given to the leader of Dir'iyah, Muhammad bin Saud, and then thereafter they proceeded to unite the various tribes and the various outlying villages in the whole of the Najd. In the whole of the Najd. And this continued for many, many years. For many, many years it continued. So now, if we think of the first Saudi state, as we mentioned, if you recall that the first Saudi state in terms of the Western calendar, then we're looking at 1744. So that was the first. He was born, of course, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, as we mentioned earlier, that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was born in 1703. So it was by the time that he was 41 years old, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he had given the Pledge of Allegiance to Muhammad bin Saud, and the partnership began. And Muhammad bin Saud was an imam. He was a scholar himself, because he studied under Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and he accepted the da'wah. And he also is referred to as an imam and a scholar and a reviver and a mujaddid. But his Shaykh was, of course, the great scholar, the imam, the mujaddid, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab bin Sulaiman at-Tamimi rahimahullah ta'ala. So they carried the da'wah, and then of course they found opposition. And when they found opposition and the enemies tried to fight them and they plotted against them and they attacked Dir'iyah, and Dir'iyah was attacked many times not just from the outlying villages, from the faraway villages, even from Riyadh. The leader of Riyadh, he attacked Dir'iyah many times, and battles ensued. And then over a period of time, by the death of Muhammad bin Saud rahimahullah ta'ala, and he died, of course, before Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, because Muhammad bin Saud died in 1179 in the Hijri calendar, and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab died in 1206 after the Hijri calendar. So by the time of the death of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, of Muhammad bin Saud, that the Najd had been conquered and it was united under one leadership. Where are the Ottomans? The Ottomans had no say. But of course, the Ottomans were getting rattled. Why were they? Because they had, some sort of authority, or there was authority in Egypt, even though it was you could be considered as a shell. And some of those rumblings, it reached them. And they began to become afraid because they were Sufis, in essence, grave worshippers and so on. And they feared that the dawah of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and the power and the authority of Muhammad bin Saud, that it would stretch, that it would go further. And of course it did. After Muhammad bin Saud, then the next king after him, or the next ruler after him, was Abdulaziz bin Muhammad bin Saud. He's the son of Muhammad bin Saud. So he was the second leader of the Dawlat al-Tawheed, of the state of Tawheed. And Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, of course, rahimahullah, continued teaching. And Abdulaziz bin Muhammad bin Saud, he also studied with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, rahimahullah ta'ala. So then the rulership went to him. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, of course, and all of the people, they continued to give him the Pledge of Allegiance. And the dawah continued, and justice was established. And Mecca and Medina, by the end of the first Saudi state, Mecca and Medina came under the control of the Saudi state, of the Dawla Saudiya, of the first Saudi state. Even the Hijaz came under their control. So now, of course, the enemies of Islam, from the grave worshippers, from the Rafida, from the Shia, now the situation arose where they felt that they needed to do something. They needed to do something. Then after a period of time, as the da'wah began to spread and more people accepted the da'wah, and the lands of Muhammad, of the Saudi state, and the Tawheed and the da'wah and the scholars and the students of knowledge, and the da'wah became widespread, thousands upon thousands of people began to accept the da'wah to Salafiyya. They started to accept the teachings of the scholars and from the early Salaf. And the books of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab became widespread. And even more so, the books of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, they became widespread. And the people, they began to live in peace. So much so, it is said in some of the books of history of that era, written by eyewitnesses of that time, that in the time of Abdulaziz bin Muhammad bin Saud, and likewise in the time of his son, who is Saud bin Abdul Aziz, that the people did not fear highway robbery anymore, nor theft. They would send out their cattle and their sheep and their camel out into the open desert, not fearing anyone, even the thieves and the highway robbers, that they were tamed in the time of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab due to the da'wah and its spreading. And the people lived in peace. They did not live in fear and danger. But again, the Ottoman Empire had no authority in that region. And as the da'wah it spread, now we have a situation where we have a Dawla Islamiyya, we have an Islamic state that is established upon justice, it is established upon Tawheed. There is no highway robbery, there is no murder, there is no killing, there is no stealing and thieving and so on. That now people are living in peace and tranquility. So this situation continued. Then Abdulaziz bin Muhammad, he died. He died, rahimahullah. He was, of course, the second king in the first kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the first state. Then he passed away, rahimahullah ta'ala. He himself passed away, and then his son became the king, Saud bin Abdul Aziz. And then he died, rahimahullah, after Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he passed away in 1206. By 1229, Saud bin Abdul Aziz bin Muhammad bin Saud, he himself passed away, which coincides with the year 1814. Now, at this stage, now that the Saudi state had moved into Mecca and Medina, because who was ruling that before them? The Sharifs of Mecca, who used to look towards the Ottomans for protection, but in reality, they were in essence in charge of the Hijaz. So the armies of Muhammad bin Saud, and they saw what was taking place in Mecca and Medina of shirk and kufr and innovations and idolatry and seeking aid from the dead in their graves, then yes, they went to Mecca and Medina and they unified the whole of the Arabian Peninsula under the family, under the House of Saud, under the Saudi family. So the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, when they were at the time, when only a decade or only a few decades earlier, that they were killing and fighting and dividing and separated from each other, living in fear, sacrificing to the graves, calling upon the dead in their graves, now they're living in peace. Now the people can travel from one place to another and not fear anyone. They do not now offer sacrifices to the jinn and to the spirit world as they regarded it. They stopped going to the graves. Then what began to happen was that the leaders or those who were in authority in Egypt, who were of European descent at that time in actuality, the Pasha, Ibrahim Pasha and Muhammad Ali, that they were commissioned by the Ottomans to recapture the Arabian Peninsula, or as they regarded it, to capture the Arabian Peninsula, even though, as we mentioned, Najd wasn't even in their control, but they decided that they were going to go in and remove them. So in reality, the aggression, it was not from the armies of Ali Saud against the Ottomans. The Ottomans did not go to Egypt. Rather, it was the Egyptians who came into the Arabian Peninsula to utterly annihilate and to destroy the dawah of Muhammad bin Saud and the Saudi state, or the first Saudi state. By that time, and when they eventually, there are several battles that took place in that period of time, from the time of Saud bin Abdul Aziz, and then his son Abdullah bin Saud bin Abdul Aziz bin Muhammad bin Saud, in 1818 in the Common Era in the Western calendar. That was the year of the end of the first Saudi state. The Egyptians, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali and Ibrahim Pasha, that they came into the Arabian Peninsula with tens and thousands of troops and weapons. And they came to Mecca, to Medina, and they fought. And they came aggressively against the people of Tawheed and the land of Tawheed to return it back as they saw it, to return it back to how it was before. Grave worship, innovations, and they didn't want the Saudi state to spread any further. And of course, the Saudis, because they were upon the Tawheed and Sunnah, that every time they came across a shrine or a grave, then they would do what the Prophet ﷺ commanded, that they would knock it down and bring it down to ground level. Not as a disrespect of the inhabitants of the graves, but rather in obedience to the command of Allah and His Messenger ﷺ. That the Prophet ﷺ said, "May the curse of Allah be upon the Jews and the Christians. For when a righteous man or a prophet used to die from amongst them, they used to take his grave as a masjid, as a place of worship." And the Prophet ﷺ said to Ali radiallahu anhu, "Do not go past a grave except that you level it, bring it down to the ground. And do not go past an image except that you deface it." So in the year 1818, eventually the Ottomans, now for the first time, they enter into the Najd, and now they want to take over the Najd. So who is the one who is rebelling against who? Who is the one and which authority is rebelling against which authority? Who had sovereignty in the Najd and the Arabian Peninsula? It was Ali Saud. It was the House of Saud. It was the Ottomans who came in now, aggressively, village after village, killing, murdering, slaughtering. Because now, in the idea of Ibrahim Pasha, who was appointed with an army to go into the Arabian Peninsula and specifically into the Najd, that it was his intention now because of that which he had been commanded with by his superiors, to go into the Arabian Peninsula and to specifically into Najd and more specifically to Dir'iyah and to destroy the house of Saud. So what did they do? They came to Dir'iyah, they surrounded it, and then after taking siege or making a siege around Dir'iyah for a period of time, eventually Abdullah ibn Saud, who was the ruler, he capitulated. And after his capitulation in 1818, right, we said that the first Saudi state, when was it established? Muhammad bin Saud and the pact between Muhammad bin Saud and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, 1744. By 1818, there had been 4 imams or 4 kings of the first Saudi state. When the Ottomans came in and they slaughtered and killed men and women, destroyed homes, burnt down villages, burnt down the palm trees from which the people used to grow their dates and so on, and crops and the field of crops. Eventually they came to Dir'iyah with thousands and thousands of soldiers. They surrounded it, and Abdullah bin Saud, the 4th king of the first state of Saudi Arabia, he capitulated because he realized that in reality, that if he didn't give in or if he didn't capitulate, that a great amount of killing would have resulted. So thereafter, when he capitulated, look what they did. In 1818, from the terms of surrender was that Abdullah bin Saud, the ruler and the king of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at that time, that he had to agree to be sent to Egypt. So for the greater good, and because there was no other choice, that he went. Then in 1819, he was sent to Istanbul, to the heart of the Ottoman Empire. And he was paraded in the streets and jeered at in the streets of Istanbul for 3 days. In some of those narrations and in the books of history, it is mentioned that they called the scholars of Sufiya and grave worship to come and debate with him. And he debated with them and he finished them off. They were not able to stand in front of his knowledge because Abdullah bin Saud, even though he was the ruler, that he used to sit in the circles and the durus of Shaykh Sulaiman bin Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, this great alim, the author of the explanation of Kitab al-Tawheed, At-Taysir al-Aziz al-Hamid fi Sharh Kitab al-Tawheed of Shaykh al-Islam Sulaiman bin Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So he used to sit in his durus and he himself became scholarly. Abdullah bin Saud, who was the ruler of the Saudi state, the first Saudi state at that time. So then what happened? They paraded him in the streets of Istanbul. Then after the 3 days, on the 4th day, they beheaded him. Then they took his body and they suspended it for several days before they threw it into the Bosphorus, into the river. They threw his body into the river. And at that point, the first Saudi state came to an end in 1818. Then only 6 years later, the second Saudi state revived itself from the same family, Ali Saud, from 1824 to 1891. But it was very small, restricted. It was only in the region of Najd. It didn't spread across to Hijaz, neither south nor further east. And then in 1891, again it was brought down, but not by the Ottomans that time, by a rival tribe. Then in 1891, they were sent to exile in Kuwait. The Ali Saud, or the House of Saud, went in exile to Kuwait. Then they returned back in 1901. And from 1901 till the present day, this is the third incarnation of the Saudi state. Established upon what? Upon that initial fundamental of Tawheed. Did they rebel against the Ottomans? No. Even when the sharifs of Mecca and Medina, when the European powers went to war against the Ottomans, listen to this very carefully. In 1916, of course, the First World War was 1914 to 1916. The Ottomans entered the war in Europe because, of course, Turkey was considered a crossroads and a European power as well as a power in Asia. That the Ottomans entered the war and they made an alliance or allegiance with the Germans. When in 1916 the European powers that they incited a revolt in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Arab lands, against the rule of the Ottomans, did the Saudis participate? The answer is no. By that time in 1901, remember what I said? That King Abdul Aziz, the founder of the present state of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the third state of Saudi Arabia, that he entered into Riyadh in 1901. And he took control of Najd in a short period of time. So Najd came back into the control of the House of Saud between 1901 and 1910. And when the European powers called upon the Arabs to rebel against the Ottoman Empire, the House of Saud did not. They did not. Because again, the Najd was not under the control of the Ottomans again, because the Ottomans did what they did and they left again. And the family of Rashid, they were the family that was in charge, or the tribe that was in charge of Najd, or one particular area of Najd, particularly Riyadh and the outlying areas, that they were the ones in charge, not the Ottomans. So when Ali Saud, when the House of Saud returned from Kuwait in 1901, Malik Abdul Aziz, or the King Abdul Aziz, the present founder of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or the founder of the present day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, from 1901, and when the European powers in 1916 called upon the Arabs to rebel, and they sent in spies to work with the Arabs, the Sharifs of Mecca and Medina and the Hijaz, and in Jordan and other places to rebel against the Ottomans, Ali Saud, the House of Saud, did not participate. And that is on record from the Europeans themselves and from the historical records of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, for whatever reason, did not participate. Because the goal of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from its beginning was that they had rulership in that place, established upon Tawheed, established upon the Kitab and the Sunnah. So there was no rebellion. Barakallahu feekum. As you can see, just in this brief kalima, or in this brief session, it should be clear cut. And wallahi, this type of historical context of what took place and what year it took place, realistically, it would take somewhere in the region of 15 to 20, maybe 40 circles or 40 classes to go through a step-by-step history of what actually took place in the Najd between 1744 and 1818. Because that is the era that you find the Mukhalifeen of Da'wat al-Salafiyya, the Khawarij, and other than them, they're saying, look, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rebelled. That's the era that they're talking about. Between 1744, Common Era, and 1818. That's the era that they're talking about. And we have proved that in reality there was no rebellion taking place, because you rebel against an authority that is in the land and ruling in the land. There was no authority in the land for the Ottomans in Najd. Barakallahu feekum. So there was no rebellion therefore. So those who justify rebellion and they say that the Ottomans, that the House of Saud rebelled and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rebelled against the Ottoman authority and against the Ottoman Caliphate, that is a nonsense. That is nonsense. Because there was no authority for them to rebel against. When in fact, eventually the Ottomans, under Ibrahim Pasha, that they entered into Dir'iyah. Then, look at what happened. and how the killing took place. I'll just give one example. We mentioned the scholar who was the grandson of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He was the Imam, the Muhaddith, the Shaykh, a great scholar of hadith of his era. His name was Sulaiman bin Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Died in the year 1233 after the Hijrah. In this context, it refers to 1818, the year of capitulation, the year that the ruler of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in his time, the fourth king, Abdullah bin Saud, that he capitulated. In that same year, he was the author, as we mentioned, he is the author of the first explanation of Kitab al-Tawheed. And it is in fact possibly, as the scholars have mentioned, the most comprehensive and the largest and the most athari explanation of Kitab al-Tawheed, Taysir al-Aziz al-Hamid. So he was the grandson of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He was killed at the age of 33 by the representative of the Ottomans, Ibrahim Pasha, who was the son of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the leader of Egypt. So Ibrahim Pasha was sent by the Ottomans to come to Dir'iyah to demolish the Salafi state on the way from the seaport of Jeddah, as they came across the whole of the Arabian Peninsula and they reached Najd, which is from the east of Medina. By the time they reached there, they went after village, destroying houses, killing and murdering the Muslims and the people of Tawheed. So when they reached Dir'iyah, that they came, Ibrahim Pasha came to Dir'iyah. Shaykh Muhammad bin Ibrahim al-Shaykh, he has a introduction to the Taysir al-Aziz al-Hamid of Shaykh Abdullah or Shaykh Sulaiman bin Abdullah, the author of Taysir al-Aziz. He mentions on page number 13 that Ibrahim Pasha, when they came to Dir'iyah and when they came to the Najd, they brought with them singing girls, singing women, who would sing and dance for them. And they would play musical instruments. And they would drink alcohol. And they had with them French military officers. Which year? 1818. They had French military officers. They had English naval officers. And they had with them Italian physicians. They brought everyone with them. They had military weapons and artillery that they were firing towards Dir'iyah. And Shaykh Muhammad bin Ibrahim al-Shaykh, he mentions that not once was the adhan heard from the encampment of the Ottomans, or the encampment of Ibrahim Pasha rather. So once Abdullah bin Saud capitulated in 1818, Ibrahim Pasha was not done. And this is the treachery of these types of people. They brought out Shaykh Sulaiman bin Abdullah, the grandson of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, in 1818. And they brought him out, and to infuriate him and humiliate him, they called for the playing of musical instruments and the singing of women around him. The Pashas, Ibrahim Pasha's hatred and desire to humiliate this scholar, eventually, because Shaykh Sulaiman bin Abdullah, he wasn't affected by what they were doing. He knew that they were trying to humiliate him. So he would continually, making dhikr, calling upon Allah, making dua, not paying any attention to the humiliation that they were trying to put him into. So Ibrahim Pasha became more enraged. So then they took him out to the graveyard in Dir'iyah. Once there, he ordered that the soldiers, that they surround Shaykh Sulaiman bin Abdullah, the grandson of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Then he commanded every soldier to point his rifle towards the Shaykh's body as he was put in the middle of them. And he commanded each of them to fire just one bullet each into the body of the Shaykh. As they fired, the Shaykh's body was torn to shreds. Shaykh Sulaiman This great scholar was only 33 years old when they killed him. For what reason did they kill him? Ask yourselves. He's a scholar. He used to teach Bukhari. He was an imam who taught Bukhari to the people, and Kitab al-Tawheed, and Aqidat al-Sahiha. So why kill him? Why? Because of their enmity. Ibrahim Pasha and those with him, their enmity for this land of Tawheed. So they each of them shot a bullet into him up until his body was torn to shreds. Then the soldiers were then commanded to gather his flesh and limbs together. So they gathered it together and put it together. Then Ibrahim Pasha went to the father of Shaykh Suleiman, who was also a scholar, Imam Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He was the son of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He was the father of Shaykh Suleiman. And he wanted to now humiliate him and say, look what we've done to your son. What are you going to do? Look what we've done to your son. So he went to him and he said to him, look, we've killed your son. So Imam Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he remained patient. He remained patient as a righteous father is. And he said to Ibrahim Pasha, he said, even if you had not killed him, he would have died anyway. Meaning, death is not in your hands. He would have died anyway. Allah would have taken him anyway. So who rebelled against who? Who came upon who? Who was the ones who were upon the haqq in reality? So when those individuals try to use the activities of Muhammad bin Abdul, like you hear sometimes from the Juhala, they say, oh, you say that Daesh are Khawarij. In reality, it's the House of Saud that are the Khawarij because they rebelled against the Ottomans. No, barakallahu feekum. The House of Saud did not rebel against the Ottomans. This is your ignorance in the history and your ignorance of reading the books that were written at that time. The chronicles that were written in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th and the 19th century. The books of Ibn Bishr or the works of history of Ibn Bishr and Ibn Hussein ibn Ghannam, Rawdat al-Afkar, and Unwan al-Majd of Uthman bin Abdullah ibn Bishr. And when you read those chronicles of that age, you begin to realize that these liars and deceivers in this time, they try to rewrite history. So they did not rebel. Furthermore, let's look at Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab himself. Did he call to rebellion ever? Did he call to the declaring of Muslims to be kuffar? Look at the statement of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in his Risala ila Ahl al-Qasim. He has a Risala or a letter that he wrote to the people of Qasim, which is also referred to as the Aqidah of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. In this letter he said, and it is a lengthy letter, but in the letter he said, وَلَا أُخْرِجُهُ, rather, let me begin. He says, وَلَا أُكَفِّرُ أَحَدًا مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ بِذَنْبٍ. He said, and I do not declare anyone from the Muslims of being a disbeliever due to a sin. This is the way of the Khawarij. Why do the Khawarij refer to the rulers today to be kuffar? Because they say these rulers do not judge by Allah's revealed, and by judging by other than Allah's revealed takes you outside of the religion. No, not necessarily, barakallahu feekum. No, it doesn't. And that's why Ibn Abbas and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to say that it is not the kufr that you think it is, rather it is the kufr lesser than kufr. As Imam al-Bukhari said, the chapter kufr dun kufr, and Imam Muslim in Kitab al-Iman, in Sahih Muslim, when he brings the chapter heading, the kufr of ingratitude. Because kufr, that by judging by Allah other than Allah is revealed, does not take a person outside of Islam, not up until certain conditions are met, such as him believing that by judging by other than Allah is revealed is better than what Allah is revealed, or equal to Allah is revealed, or that it is permissible to judge by Allah is revealed, by other than what Allah is revealed. Then yes, Because now this person has made manifest that he actually believes in his heart. He believes that by judging by other than what Allah has revealed is better or equal or even permissible and on par with that which Allah has revealed. And it is something that is halal, that he has made istihlal of that to judge by other than what Allah has revealed. Then yes. But as for saying that anyone who judges by other than Allah has revealed, he's a kafir, basing it upon the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ, then that ayah is not a proof for them. Because Ibn Abbas, who knows the Quran better than all of these Khawarij put together, from the first of them to the last of them, said it is not the kufr that you think it is. It is not the kufr that exists from Islam. Because there's an ayah also in Surah Al-Ma'idah, whomsoever does not judge by Allah is revealed, they are the fasiqun, they are the sinners. Whomsoever does not judge by Allah is revealed, they are the transgressors, the dhalimun. And Imam Ibn Abdul Barr in At-Tamheed, what did he say? He said that here the meaning is, as the Salaf, they agreed that that judging by Allah than Allah is revealed, it is not the kufr that exits the person from the fold of Islam. Ibn Kathir said the same thing. Ibn Taymiyyah said the same thing. So here, Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab said, وَلَا أُكَفِّرُ أَهَدًا مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ بِذَنْبٍ. I do not declare anyone from the Muslims to be a kafir, to be a disbeliever because of a sin. Judging by other than what Allah has revealed is a sin. وَلَا أُخْرِجُهُ مِنْ دَائِرَةِ الْإِسْلَامِ. And I do not remove him and expel him from the fold of Islam. This is the Khawarij. So here Shaykh al-Islam testifying that he's not from the Khawarij. I don't declare people to be kuffar. Daesh do. They do. The Khawarij they do. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Daesh. And look what he said here. Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala. وَأَرَى الْجِهَادَ مَادِيًا مَا كُلِّ إِمَامٍ بَرًّا كَانَ أَوْ فَاجِرًا وَصَلَاةُ الْجَمَاعَةِ خَلْفَهُمْ جَائِزَةٌ. I hold that jihad is continuous and ongoing, and with every imam, meaning every ruler who rules over a land, regardless of whether he is righteous or sinful, and the congregational prayer behind them is permissible. Congregational prayer behind them is... Now ask these Khawarij, what do they say about the rulers? They say your rulers, they are sinners, they are transgressors, they are wrongdoers, there is no prayer behind them, rather they are kuffar. What did Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab say? He said that even if, regardless of whether they are righteous or sinful, even if they are, as he has mentioned, barran kana or fajiran, that you fight alongside them, meaning that you join their armies. Not the armies of the renegades, not the armies of the Khawarij, not the insurgencies of Daesh, these little encampments that they set up and call it an Islamic State. These people that throw fear and instill fear into the hearts of the Muslims by scaring them and putting fear into their hearts. Do they not fear Allah? That they scare the believers? Allah will scare them Yawm al-Qiyamah. Those who scare the believers, Allah will scare them. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab also said in the same Risala, Naam, he said, وَأَرَى وَجُوبُ السَّمْعِ وَطَاعَةِ لِأَئِمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ بَرِّهِمْ وَفَاجِرِهِمْ مَا لَمْ يَأْمُرُوا بِمَعْصِيَةِ اللَّهِ. Look at this. He said that I hold the obligation of listening and obeying the Muslim rulers, whether they are righteous or whether they are sinful, so long as it is not in an affair in which they command disobedience to Allah. Meaning, even if the ruler is sinful, you obey him. If he is righteous, you obey him. And if they command you with disobedience, then in that action they are not to be obeyed. Then he said, rahimahullah ta'ala, that whoever takes the khilafah, whoever takes the authority in the land, and the people gather under him, and they are pleased with him as their leader, or whether he has overpowered them with the sword up until he became their leader, the one in authority, then obedience is obligatory to him, and it is haram to revolt against him. Haram. So even if they say that, the House of Saud only got into power because they fought their way to power, they gained authority. They were people of Tawheed. They were people of Sunnah. They read the book of Allah. They were not from the Rafida. They were not Khawarij. They were the students of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. The House of Saud were the students of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Who are you, Daesh? You are the students of Iblis. And you are the students of Dajjal. Min ad-Dajjajila. You are the students of a liar amongst the great liars. Whereas the House of Saud were the students of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Abdullah bin Saud was a student of Sulaiman bin Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the author of Taysir al-Aziz. Who are you the students of? You are the students of Khawarij. You are the students of your forefathers who rebelled against Ali. How can you compare what you are doing to that which the House of Saud did? They are more righteous than you. They are more pious than you. They have more authority than you. They are better to their people than you. There is more scholars with them than with you. In fact, you have no scholars, and all of the scholars are with them. All of the great scholars are with the House of Saud. All of them. And not one of them is with you. Just like when Ibn Abbas went to the Khawarij, he said that I see you here. I see you here, the Khawarij, and I do not see a single companion with you, meaning I don't see a single scholar with you from the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, not one. Where are they all? They're all with Ali. Just like with the Daesh today. All of the scholars are with the House of Saud. And none of the scholars are with you. Who do you have? Runaway teenagers from Trinidad. Runaway teenagers from England. Runaway teenagers who were selling drugs yesterday and planting bombs today. Who were pimping yesterday and killing people today. Who do you have from the scholars? Nothing. You are the Khawarij. You go to the Quran and you twist its meanings, and then you say this is from Allah. Wallahi, it is not from Allah, your understanding. Your understanding is from Shaitan. The understanding of the Kitab and the Sunnah is with the scholars. Look what Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab said. وَأَرَى وَجُوبَ السَّمْعِ وَطَاعَةِ لِأَئِمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ بَرِّهِمْ وَفَاجِرِهِمْ. I hold it to be obligatory to hear and obey the Muslim rulers, whether they be pious or whether they be tyrannical and sinful. Do you believe that, Daesh? Do they believe that, those Khawarij? Of course they don't. And they want to say that Ali Saud or the House of Saud rebelled against the Ottomans. Wallahi, they did not rebel. Rather, it was the Ottomans who oppressed them. It was the Ottomans who slaughtered them. It was Ottomans who made their wives widows. It was the Ottomans who took their leaders and took them to Istanbul, as they did with Abdullah ibn Saud. It was them who paraded him in the streets of Istanbul, not the other way around. It was them who beheaded him, not the other way around. It was them who hung his body in Istanbul and then threw him into the sea or into the river. It was them, barakallahu feekum. And then they accuse, oh, you knocked down the tombs of the righteous. Yes, the people of Tawheed knocked down the tombs of the righteous, because the righteous themselves never asked you to put tombs over their bodies. Because that is a doorway, barakallahu feekum. That is a doorway to shirk. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he forbade it. So we forbid it, just as he forbade it. Yes, the people of Tawheed and the armies of the House of Saud, they went to Karbala and they demolished the shrine that was built over the grave of Hussein radiyallahu anhuma. Yes, they did do that because the people were worshipping him. And he would be the first. He never commanded anyone to worship him. So they did that. Yes. Barakallahu feekum. They acted in accordance to the sunnah. They acted, barakallahu feekum, in accordance to the sunnah, in accordance to the establishment of Tawheed. And wallahi, I'm trying to stop myself from going on because there is a lot more that can be said of the various chronologically what took place, but this is not really a lecture like this. Doesn't allow for chronology of events to be cited in order. What took place in each year in that period of time between 1744 and 1818. And then in the second Saudi state between 1824 and 1891. Because even then, barakallahu feekum, between 1824 1891, even though the state of Tawheed, the Dawla of Tawheed, that it was only restricted to the area of Najd, even then they were attacked. They wouldn't leave them alone because the enmity was against Tawheed. Their enmity was against Tawheed and following the Sunnah as it was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Until this day, the third Saudi state, ask every Khariji, every Rafidi, because the Khawarij and the Rawafid are two sides of the same coin. Every single one of them, ask them who their greatest enemy is. They will say the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That's what they will say. Like Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, this Khariji in Jordan. In his writings, what does he say? He says that Makkah and Medina are Darul Kufr. They are lands of disbelievers. Even Makkah and Medina. So what is Darul Islam then? If Makkah and Medina is Darul Kufr, and Allah is worshipped there, tawaf of the house is made, universities for ilm and knowledge are based there, children and adults are reciting the Quran and worshipping Allah 24 hours a day. People are making tawaf for Allah around the house of Allah. He calls it Darul Kufr, Darul Kufr. This is what they say. Their greatest enmity is still reserved for the house of Saud because their enmity is towards Tawheed. They hate Tawheed, and when they quote Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, they think they are quoting him in their own favor. So you find the Khawarij, because they want to win over the Salafis, the youth from the Salafis who haven't studied very much, or the children of the people of Tawheed, they want to grasp them. So then they say to them, listen, we teach Tawheed, we teach the books of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, we teach the books of Ibn Taymiyyah, but by Allah, wallahi al-azim, they are the enemies of Ibn Taymiyyah, they are the enemies of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Because Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim and Imam al-Bukhari and Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Imam Malik and Imam al-Shafi'i and those who came before them and those who came in between them from Ahlul Sunnah, the Salafiyun, the scholars of Hadith and Salafiyah, all of them were united against the Khawarij. So don't believe those liars who say that the Saudi state rebelled, or the house of Saud and Muhammad bin Saud rebelled in 1744. He did not rebel. He did not incite a revolution against the Ottomans. Rather, it was the Ottomans who killed them, their women and their children and their men, village after village, as they went through from around about 1814, 1815, then returned again in 1817 and 1818. It was them who carried out slaughter and bloodshed upon the people of Tawheed. Where do you hear the Sufis mentioning that? Then they say, oh, the Saudis, they joined the European countries to demolish the Saudis, to demolish the Ottoman Empire. Kadhabin. The Saudis did not participate when they were in Najd in 1901, all the way through. When the Europeans incited rebellion against the Ottomans, the House of Saud did not participate in 1916. Or before that, no, after that. The Ottoman state was doing a good job of their own downfall themselves by worshipping at the graves and by opposing the Sunnah. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala humiliates those who oppose the religion of Allah. إِذَا تَبَايَتْتُمْ بِالْعِينَ وأخذتم بأذناب البقر ورديتم بالزرع وتركتم الجهاد سلط الله عليكم ظلا لا يرجع لا نعم. The hadith, the end part of it I've forgotten. He'll come back to me in a minute. That those who participate in usury and they hold on to the tails of cattle and they become satisfied with the cultivation of the earth, وَتَرَكْتُمُ الْجِهَادِ, and they abandon jihad, and you abandon jihad, the Prophet ﷺ said, you participate in riba, in ina, which is a form of usury, and you hold on to the tails of cattle, you get involved in the cultivation of the dunya, you abandon jihad in the path of Allah, sallallahu alaykum dhulla, Allah will send down humiliation upon you. Allah will send down the humiliation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not remove it. حَتَّى تَرْجِعُوا إِلَى دِينِكُمْ. That's the end of the hadith. حَتَّى تَرْجِعُوا إِلَى دِينِكُمْ. Up until you return back to your religion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this is how He humiliates people who oppose His religion. It was not Ali Saud that rebelled. Barakallahu feekum. And upon that note, inshallah, we will conclude this session. وجزاكم الله خيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.